start, folks are still joining in here, so we'll go ahead and get started, and people will join as we go. So welcome to the next episode of Talking Hobies. So this is episode 3 of our series. If you don't know me, my name is Rich McVeigh. I'm the president of the International Hobie Class Association and your host for the series. Just a quick sort of public service announcement about who we are. I mean, we are a group of sailors and volunteers from around the world that organize Hobie sailing events. And since the pandemic has left us with a lot of time on our hands and many of our usual events have been canceled, we thought this was a really nice way to reach out and engage with our membership and hopefully provide some useful information for you in your sailing. So if you're not a member of the Hobie Class Association, we sincerely encourage you to join. We can't do these types of things without your support. If you are a member, thank you. If you would like more information about the class, you can find us at hobieclass.com or at ihca.class on Facebook. All right, so this is a Zoom webinar. It's a little bit different than Zoom meeting that many are familiar with. So there'll be 2 presenters on the screen, myself and Steve. I'll introduce in a moment. And for you to interact with us, you want to look around on your screen and there'll be a button there for a Q&A button and a chat button. So you can chat with the entire group on the chat, and if you have questions, you can submit them on the Q&A tab, and we'll try to respond to them as we go. So really happy tonight to have Steve Fields with us from the Hobie Company. So say hello, Steve, introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone that is around the world. My name is Steve Fields, and let me see what my business card says this month. Director of International Strategic Development, Distribution, and Event Management. So there it is, a new title from the old position of the Managing Director of Hobie Asia Pacific. Been over in the States now, just after the World. So obviously the World Championships in Florida. Fantastic event, and then moved up to North Florida, just north of Gainesville, kind of that late November, early December period. Still working from Hobie, and like everyone else, kind of in a lockdown mode. I've been out to Oceanside a few times now to help with the factory reopening, and just waiting for Europe to allow some international travels to go there, and got a few projects on with Hobie Europe. So great to have everyone here, and I hope we get a good following, and look forward to what everyone has to say.
All right, excellent. All right, welcome all. So we have a live audience tonight, and then we'll also be recording this and sharing it on YouTube for folks around the world that were unable to join live. So look for that to pop up on YouTube on the Hobie Class channel. All right, so tonight's subject is all about rudders, and rudders is a big topic. Over the years of manufacturing, there have been many different types of rudders, and we've put together a little bit of a presentation kind of going through the history of rudders and then talking about rudder systems and some of the changes over the years and some of the maintenance items of how you keep your rudders working well. So let me start and share that with you here. Right, so, and most of this really comes from, we know there were more. We know there were at least 11 types of rudders manufactured over the years, and a lot of this really comes from what was done in the North America in North America. We know there was a few others that I'm not going to touch upon in other parts of the world. Tried to get as much information as I could, but I know I missed a few. So why don't we start going through these, Steve? You want to talk about these a little bit, and I'll change slides?
There's an old classic there, the old Hobie 18 alloy castings. Like you said, there's been so many rudders out there, and as you had indicated before, the ABS plastic was the original rudders, easy to manufacture, generally forgiving, except that the sun does break them down a bit, but for that point in time, they were not a bad rudder altogether. Just a nice overall recreational blade, and I think I want to use that word.
Yeah, so a few of these photos here is kind of a bit of I was out sailing in a week, and one of the places we sail at, there's a little bit of a graveyard in the back there, and I was climbing around back there getting some of these photos, so.
This is not rum, by the way, okay? Just so everyone knows, it's iced tea, so down in Florida and all that.
Next slide. Come on, next slide. All right. All right, so I believe this was one of the really early aftermarket years that was called the Super Rudder, but I couldn't find, are you familiar with these? I couldn't find anything on it to really identify it.
It's funny that you should say the Super Rudders. So just back a little bit, after the ABS rudders that came with the FXone rudders, um, I don't think many people broke them. They were still very flexible, but they're very thin. And then you mentioned Super Rudders that remind me, back in the late 70s, Richard Radich, somewhere down St. Pete Way, I used to work there, and he used to build the Super Rudders. And I can remember how slap happy we were with how to mix things. And back then, it was a polyester based product, and you had MEK. Well, current models, you have a nice little squeeze bottle that tells you the exact CCs. It's all contained. We used to use this plastic tube, and I used to put it in my mouth, and you would suck the MEK up on this number. So you're sucking all these fumes, and that's how I used to mix polyester rudder and gel cut. So I tell you what, when Rich came up with that design, we couldn't keep up with manufacturing. And I think back then they were sold through the hotline and through some dealers. So Richard Ratch did some windsurfing rudders, but he also did that Super Rudders. And that kind of be in that late 80s, early 80s period. Very, very stiff blade. But they also had that inherent problem of all blades that were constructed that way, but they would sometimes split on the seam. And that's just the way that they were designed and put together. But I think that was the first real blade that really made the Hobie 16 come alive. As far as performance, it was night and day difference over the ABS blades and or the FXone polycarbonates.
All right, we had to search high and low to find these photos here. So these wooden rudders, these were common. I don't know how common they were, but these were made by some of the Brazilian sailors years ago, and they were absolute works of art. I only ever saw one being sailed once. I never sailed one myself. As far as the only ones I know around now are usually hanging on someone's wall as a piece of art. But Steve, you ever get a chance to sail these?
Yeah, they're not a bad blade. The nice thing about it is, working with timber is a pretty easy thing to do. You can, change some of the tapers pretty straightforward. And, people have been building things out of wood. As long as you did it in sections and glued it together with stuff, it was a very, very stiff blade. I guess the only downside is that when you do nick that wood, then it's basically a polyester or an epoxy coating. Once you nick it, then water gets from the wood itself and then starts degrading. But they were an alternative to the Super Rudders and later on some of the glass blades. And I think the attraction is you could use lighter wood, and they are a lighter blade. They're still within class rules as far as that weight. But I think that was one of the advantages. Not only were they a work of art, it's just a beautiful rudder, but it combated some of that weight that you got out of the early days of the molded rudders, where you had the two halves and laminate, and then like a polyester bog or filler or joining compound to join it together. But I think you're right. There's a few people that I know have them on the mantle, the wall piece, and they're definitely a collector's item for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right, so the original EPO was, I think my years are a little bit off here, was 83. We think maybe 84 through the late 80s to early 90s, not 100% on that ending year, but it was widely distributed in the North American market. Not so common overseas, but very common in those years in North America. Was a popular rudder and still is. But you can see the one on the top here, I think was a good example. I think I may have another one later that they had a little trouble in the long term with sun exposure and they would degrade. So Steve, what's happening here physically with the rudder blade, you think?
It's just a UV breakdown. So it's like a lot of products that over time with plastic products, epoxy products, as the UV breaks them down. Even our kayaks, 20 years ago, the same thing. There weren't UV inhibitors. The neat thing about the EPO is it was such a ahead of its time product at that stage. It was a foam core, and typically they had like a blown foam core, a high density core, and it was wrapped with epoxy resin and glass material and put in this massive press, and it squeezed it all together. You brought it out and trimmed it, and voila, it was just a completed rudder. So not only was it super lightweight, but more importantly, it was, you know, almost indestructible, and they're still out there today. So it had its shortcomings, but the EPO definitely was one of those things like the Rudders rudder. So you went from the plastic blades to the glass, and that was a major improvement to the racing market. And then from there, you know, obviously people are still looking for lightweightness. They're still looking for more stiffness. And the other one side of it is the manufacturing process. Traditional glass rudders as such were very labor intensive, taping it up, spraying the gel coat, putting a tie layer, your laminate pieces, your foam materials, your cores, clamping it back together, popping it back out, trimming it up. There's a lot of labor, where this just really, it cut the labor probably by about 60%. And still they're very sought after, and kind of to led us to later on into the developing the EPO2s, and then the what we're currently selling for the last few years is the EPO3. But again, these are also collector's items, and I see a lot of people have these hanging in their man cave, and you know, would never ever drill holes. I had two, I think, for probably 20 years that I never drilled it, because I just knew they were going to be a collector's item at one stage. But very good blade, and very, very popular.
All right, so following these, this was, I guess, the little step down, right, into general recreational rudder was the nylon rudder, and the PCG, which I was unable to track down the picture of, was a black rudder blade that came along sometime in the 90s. You remember specifics on that, Steve?
Yeah, they had the same. They both came out about the same time. They're all just a resin-based material that's injected. And these are still used on our recreational catamarans now. Bravo, Waves, Getaways, things like that. They're just indestructible. The nice thing is, over the years, once we went to that PCG resin-based rudder, is we put a little bit more profile into it, a lot more foil shape into it, as opposed to, say, some of the early ABS rudders and some of the Lexan. Lexan's had a bit of shape as well, but they're still used today. They still have their place. You can run it up and down beaches and drag it over coral. You can drop it off the back of the trailer on the boat ramp and take a file to it. It's still probably one of the best recreational rudders out there. It's indestructible, and it's price pointed. It's also very forgiving, especially on some older boats. I mean, you know, the problem you have is you've got an older boat with some older gudgeons and some old gudgeon screws. You go put something really stiff on there, like an EPO3, all that stiffness has to transfer somewhere, and that's going to be into the transom area. So I probably don't advise that for people out there that bought a $1,000 to $2,000 or $3,000 boat that are recreational sailing. These blades suit that purpose, and that flex definitely helps you not transfer that pressure and the loading in the load bearing points into the old gudgeons, and more important, some of the older transoms out there that, you know, have probably got some fiberglass rot in them. They're probably 30 or 40 years old. So just keep that in mind. If you've got an old boat, you know, it's like anything else. Something has to give. In this case, the rudder gives. On the EPO 3s and 2s, and even the black EPOs, they were not a very flexible blade, and that was the idea behind it, is total control, basically.
That's a good point and a good segue. We're going to come to the gudgeons here in just a moment. All right, so following the EPO, there was the race rudder that was sold in the mid-90s. This was a polyester fiberglass rudder. I mean, I remember sailing with these for years. My recollection is it sailed nicely. I didn't have any real complaints with it. Any thoughts on that, Steve?
One of the things that came out of it, and I think while that blade was in and out of EPO periods, and it's still produced in some countries, from the early days of the super rudders and other people making rudders, what put the rudder together was a joining compound. And typically you'd use a polyester resin base. Cabosil was one of the fillers you put in there. There's quite a few different fillers. Chop strand milled fibers would go in there. The problem is it really wasn't a gluing compound as such. And the extenders of the fillers, the idea was just trying to expand the resin to reduce the weight. The downside of the super rudders and other things is you still had all that resin content. They're very heavy. When you went to these race rudders, we then went to a foam core. In the early days, I think it was probably a Divinacell, like an H60. I know when I was building the Hobie 18 center boards for many, many years, we used a 2-pack foam material. It's called HD 800. And you'd have a polyester and alloy mold. You would pour in this 2-part mix, A and B. You'd mix it up quick. You had about 10 or 15 seconds to get it into the mold, clamp it up. And it was an expanding foam. The beauty of that was it was a very stiff foam, but it didn't weigh anything. So the race rudders took a core section. So you would have the 2 halves that would be, gel coated, laminated up. You'd put a very small layer of a joining compound. Then you'd put in what we call the cookie, which was either a Divinacell or this HD 800 foam, and then clamp it together. And you would reduce the weight probably 40%. So you had the ability to have the stiffness of the glass in there, but you got rid of the core, and therefore you made a very, very light rudder. Very popular for many, many years, but they still had that same thing of the seams kind of letting go, especially towards the tip, by people dragging it on the beach or beaching, and it would eventually wear through and you'd get some splits. They also didn't have quite that stiffness that you would have in an EPO rudder blade. And there were some crackings, and they would usually crack just below where that rudder casting is in the bottom part. So you can imagine you get the rudder casting in the blade, and the blade was flexing. So the weak link was that sharp edge of the casting. So the warranties back then were generally related in that fat portion of the head, just below the rudder casting bit of cracking. That's before we learned how to use different glues or putting some glass tubes in there for longitudinal support. But good blade. Hobie Europe still produce a blade called the White Knight, and it's based on this same thing. Polyester resins, polyester gel coat, and polyester joining compound with a cord material of some description to put it together. They're still on the market. You can still buy them. It's a good alternative for a recreational sailor that is looking for a little bit of performance, but wants to have a little bit of give to the boat so you're not going to blow the back of the boat off, especially if you've got, say, a 30-plus-year-old boat. You really got to keep that in mind. So it's a good compromise for a guy looking for a little bit of performance, but still having a bit of flex characteristics to save the back of the boat.
Right, so EPO 2 came out roughly 2004. Maybe was on the market for what, 8-10 years, don't recall exactly. There were 3 sort of flavors of the EPO 2, and maybe Steve, just talk about your design and the different constructions. So there were the white one, the carbon Kevlar, and the all carbon one. This one on the right here is actually one of my rudders. It's a carbon Kevlar that I've had and had for years and was very happy with. Definitely, it steered very well, was my comments on sailing with it over the years. So Steve, go ahead.
A lot of that was aesthetics more than anything else, to be quite honest. Mm-hmm. So your structural part of the rudder, yes, Kevlar can play a role and carbon can play a role. And the downside of that is that there are other things, you just can't put a carbon skin on it unless you're using some really good resins and a very good laminate schedule, especially on a Hobie 16. The downside of the EPOs are a brilliant rudder, and what we did is we took a rudder blade, the EPO originally, and we digitized it. And when we did that, we found that the EPOs were not very symmetrical and actually had some flat spots in it. So we took the original design, we cleaned it up a little bit, and then instead of going from polyester molds, we went obviously into alloy and CNC where they're exactly the same. The original laminate schedule I produced, and we used at that stage a blown foam core, which is HD 800. Now, everything was good except when we shifted our production to another manufacturer. With this HDH core, when it's produced, once it comes out of the mold, you need to let it gas off. It will contain like a gassing material. And I can remember just a nightmare when these first came out. You could actually put these in the sun and hear them crystallize and bubble. And what we had found is the manufacturer at that stage was taken straight out of the mold, and you would sandblast the wax off them and then start building rudders. That gas is still in this foam. It hasn't really cured yet. So we had to deal with that a little bit. There's a lot of replacements. And once we did that and got this thing stable down, said, guys, you got to pop this thing out. You got to sandblast it. You got to leave it for 7 days in a rack, and then you go ahead and join it. And that eliminated the problems. The only thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to clean up that trailing edge a little bit, and hence came the EPO3. We also, on the EPO3, we switched from a cord material, whether it be what I call as a cookie, into an epoxy glue. And we also put a glass tube down the guts of it. And you can choose a tube inside to control some of that flexing this way. So the real changes from EPO2 to EPO3 is we got rid of an epoxy core, HD 800 core, and a traditional gluing process to an epoxy glue, and a little bit of reinforcing with a fiberglass tube down it for stiffing. And it's still used today. I still think it's probably one of the better rudders out there. You got to understand, we're building boats that are recreational boats that also have to be racing boats. So it's kind of a mixed market. They're a very forgiving blade, as far as they're a very wide or a thicker profile. But I tell you what, from my point of view, from running Worlds or anything else, these rudders, you can bolt them on and go sailing. Where, years and years, and especially back in the early 80s, people were notching rudders and having adjusters on them and trying to work out the rake and all kind of things. And these, we designed a blade that would just bolt on, and that's it, set and forget, and just go sailing. Trailing edge was cleaned up. The profiles were very symmetrical. And as far as stiffness, they're probably one of the stiffest blades that we have out there. And I think of the last probably 6 years, I think I've replaced 4 blades in total. And I think that was coming from, we have some plugs at the very top of the rudder blades that we put some inserts inside, so that when you drilled your bolt holes in for your upper rudder castings and your lower rudder castings, it gave it a little bit of strength. But I'm very pleased. That blade, I don't see me going to an EPO4. There's nothing else to change. We've got the manufacturing process right. We've got extremely good tooling. The consistency is good. And something interesting, every 10 rudders we take and put on a bending machine. And we have areas that we clamp the rudder blade in, and then we have a hole drilled about 1.5 inches from the tip. And then we put up to, I think it's 220 kilos of loading to see if we can break that. And that's kind of roughly 1 in 10, I think, is a ratio for trying to do some testing. So we've got some really, really good QC. And for anyone looking to upgrade their rudders, fiberglass, EPO2s, old EPOs, or super rudders, or anything else out in the flavor that's made, you can't go wrong with an EPO3. It's a really nice blade. I still, and I know a lot of the racing guys do a little bit of work to the blades, especially to that leading edge, because it is a molded blade. And while it is post-trimmed, I still think there's a little bit of work. I use a bit of probably 800 wet and dry, and just tweak that profile up a little bit on that leading edge, especially that bottom third of the blade, and do that. So it's quite good.
Back it up. Oh, now look what I did. There we go. There we go.
Yeah.
So while we're on the EPO3, I'm always really religious about keeping the thing covered and out of the sun. And I'm not, one, it protects it, it keeps it out of the sun. Can you comment on that? UV sensitivity with these compared to the older ones?
Yeah, gel coat's improved. I mean, the last 20 years, any of the plastic products and the resins that are out there have changed. I mean, you look at the big boats that had problem with osmosis and things like that, you know, the different grades, and it's no different than the polyester resins and the gel coats. We use a gel coat on the outside, and we do that for a repair point of view. I saw one question earlier. So it is a gel coat, polyester based on the exterior for cleaning up. As far as leaving the sun, they're very, very forgiving. Will it break down? I'm sure in 10 or 15 years, you'll get a little breaking down, but nothing to the effects that you'll see like on the old EPO2, and definitely nothing like you'd see some of the older rudder blades that were polyester, where like the Rudders blades or things like that, with the sun, the gel coat is just going to break down. You're not going to have that with these. Covering up, I think the best thing for covering up is so that it doesn't get nicks in it. And that's the biggest thing to do. So the covering to me is to protect the foil so it doesn't get scratches. As far as UV side, it's better if you do cover it, but I'm not that stressed over UV damage to the EPO. I'm more worried about scratches and dings and dents, which has a major effect on laminar flow and just general sailing ability.
All right. Well, while we're on it, we had another question just come in about repairs to the EPO3. This one was particularly, I guess, sounds like a ding on the tip. Suggested procedure there?
Just white gel coat. That's it.
Okay.
So it's just a normal white gel coat. Any of the good white glosses these days will pretty much match on that. And it's just a case of the biggest thing is making sure that you get rid of the salt in all these repairs. I mean, a lot of people think you just rinse it off with water and the salt disappears. That sometimes doesn't happen. Definitely use some warm water, a stiff brush to get that salt out of there. In Australia, I use a product called Salt Away. It actually breaks down the salt component and also get it really, really dry. So get rid of the salt. It really can embed itself into the rudder, especially some of the fibers, and it really dry, and then cut it back to whatever you need to do. And then you can take and either brush on some gel coat, or my preference is spray it on. It's a lot less post work as far as, you know, littering it back down with your various different grades of paper and then buffing it back up. But the white gel coat will easily fix that. If you do the trailing edge, you can just use a clear gel coat. Just be mindful of how thick you put it on, and also your catalyst ratios to just keep those catalyst ratios down. So in just pure resin, it can crack and split on a little bit, but they're very easy, and that's kind of why we went to a polyester base exterior, just so that the home user can use it and not have to go and mix, you know, West epoxies and things like that.
Okay, let's do the next one. Okay, so just some of the other rudders out there, some quick reference points to these, and some of the other boats, the Tiger, the FXone, the Fox, the Hobie 20 used slightly different rudders and different shape rudders. Any comments here, Steve?
No, they're boat specific, but if you really look at from the lower rudder casting down, they all have a very similar characteristics. Obviously, with you going into the Tiger and FXone, you could actually use an EPO3. They're stiff enough, and you can do it. You just got to play around with your drag holes. The Fox, you're just trying to take and control some of the water flow onto the back of the boat, and that way you reduce a bit of drag at the back of the boat, and just trying to clean that up a bit. But at the end of the day, foils or foils or foils, as a rule of thumb, you're looking at a chord distance, you're looking at a shape, and they're all very similar shapes. Obviously, when you go into some of the more high performance boats, the thinner that you make anything, as generally speaking, the faster it's going to be. But the downside of being thin is the ability for turning. And that's at that front profile. That's why the EPO3 and even 2 and even the original EPO was a very fat front end. You know, no matter what angle you steered with the thing, you're going to get attachment and it's going to steer. Is it the fastest rudder? It's not. Is it the most forgiving? It's quite good. So, you know, some of the new modern blades are a lot thinner. You're probably looking around that 15 to 18 millimeters thick, but they still have that same profile. But that's a whole range of boats, whether it be, Hobies and other brands out there. They all share similar features. Obviously, some of the more modern boats, they make up that foil shape and chord length with going with depth as that hull leads. So they're very long boards, very short chord lengths, but still that profile, if you really look at it, it is similar in here. But that's just fluid dynamics. And over the years, it's getting better and better and better. I mean, look at foils now with foiling boats in America's Cup. It's all a foil. It all does the same thing. It all creates lift. It's just how you achieve it and how you shape it. And then also makes a big difference now is the technology with the different fabrics pre-pegs and post-pegs and infusions of how to make these things stiff. Because that's the real key. The stiffer it is, the better it's going to be as far as a steering capability or a lifting point of view. So all those boats share the same. The Tigers and FXones were very similar. The Fox was definitely one of its own, slightly different. And then you go into the Wildcat, another generation again, but they all share very similar Hobie characteristics.
All right, so moving on, so getting to sort of the other parts of the system now, and some introduce some of these and talk about sort of the overall rudder system. Maybe it's a good time to back up and show the video. Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, I have prepared a little video here. Let me show that here. Find my video. Share screen. This one. Oops. Come on.
What we have here is 2018 Hobie 16 that comes standard with the EPO3 rudder blade, and we'll show you some of the features of this and how it should properly be used. So there's really two positions for the rudder: all the way up, all the way down. Anything in between is really not going to deliver the best steering. So this is the up position. Put this down, you raise this, lower the rudder blade down, and right here we have a cam. This cam is a rotating piece that engages on a metal plate inside the upper casting and locks the rudder in the down position. So you'll hear here there's a snap. Okay, and now the rudder is down. You can see here how tight the upper and lower castings fit together. And raise this, now the rudder is all the way down. What's important to note here as well is when the rudder is down and when it's properly fitted to the boat, you don't want anything wiggling. So you can see here, this rudder blade has been tuned and shimmed, so it does not wiggle side to side. It does not wiggle front to back. The system, the rudder doesn't fit well in the system and everything wiggles around. It's simply not going to steer well. Right? So here, this is the tiller crossbar that connects the two rudders. It's on the top here. This thing right here is called the Hobie 20 tiller connector system. Originally introduced with the Hobie 20, but it's got a standard production on all the Hobie Cat boats for many years now. It's really very simple to use. It uses this little bungee with this little clip that goes on the top and simply locks it in place. It's really easy to assemble and disassemble. Now to change the toe in and toe out, if this piece is threaded, it's really easy to just simply thread it in and thread it out to adjust that. On the older systems, you had to use a screwdriver, unloosen a screw, and push it in and out. And that still works fine, but this is just a much cleaner, much simpler system that works well all the time. Okay, so the cam here inside the lower casting is attached to a spring-loaded plunger. So there's a cam, a plunger, a spring, and a set screw. This controls the tension on the rudder blade so that the rudder stays down. The system is designed, though, to release the rudder if you hit an object or when you're coming into the beach. When these are beach catamarans, they were designed to be sailed on and off the beach. So as the way the system was originally designed to be used, as you sail into the beach, you hit the bottom, the rudder would release and would kick up. This is a really great convenience for you coming in and out of the beach. And it's properly adjusted, it works perfectly like that. These parts inside here, however, require maintenance. And that really is the critical issue that comes along. People don't maintain their boats. The parts stop working over years. They're plastic parts, they do wear out over time, but really the critical thing is keeping them clean and keeping them lubricated. If they're not lubricated, they're not clean, is when you start to get into trouble and the rudder doesn't release properly. The other thing that can happen if the system is too loose is the rudder can release prematurely. So you can be sailing along in some breezy conditions and the rudder will just suddenly kick up for no reason at all, which usually results in a really bad experience in terms of your steering. So you adjust the tension, and we'll show you that, how to do that to get your rudder set to the proper release tension. Now to bring the rudder up, you can pull firmly on the tiller arm, like so. Rudder will come up. Okay. Same thing will happen if there's an impact along the bottom as you're coming in and you hit the bottom. The rudder will automatically release itself and relieve the tension on the bottom. The consequences of this, if the rudder is set too tight, the cam is set too tight and the rudder doesn't release when you hit the bottom, the consequences of that is you're going to have damage somewhere to the rudder blade or the back of the boat or the rudder in the rudder system. So you want this adjusted properly so it works every time. The system is adjusted properly, it gives you a really good steering feel and improves your sailing. Okay, so what I want to show here is just really a close-up of the parts here. So here you can see the lower casting. This is what's called the rudder cam. Rudder cam is held in with this pin right inside of here. There is a plunger that goes down inside and some internal parts with a spring and a set screw. This piece rotates, okay, and this little hook engages on a metal plate which is inside the upper rudder casting to lock the rudder down. The plunger seats right in this little recessed area when it's in a lockdown position. And right in here is where you want to do lubrication. That's the moving parts right there. So you can see here, this is the upper rudder casting now. And here you can see the metal plate that engages on the hook to lock the rudder down.
All right, let's get out of this. Stop the sharing. All right, well, that was my attempt at a selfie video in the driveway there. A little bit of wind noise, but anyway, any comments there on all that?
A couple things. Great to see people, understand how the cam things. Over the years, I think the biggest thing I've seen is people who haven't used their boat in a while. The first thing they do is on the trailer, on the beach, generally on the trailer, they lock the rudder down and they go to kick it back up with the tiller arm and the rudder stays down. There's a couple things going on. Now, at the bottom of the casting is a Delrin screw and threaded. You have a spring inside of it, and then you have the plunger in the top. Most of the people are sailing in a saltwater condition. You've got dissimilar metals. You've got a spring inside of there as well. And a lot of times things will kind of seize up, and they wonder why the cam either rotates or it breaks the head off. If you haven't used your boat for a while, the best thing to do is to take and lift your tiller arm up and move the rudder cam up and down with your hand. Free it up a little bit or get a little bit of spray in there. I'm not a huge fan of silicone sprays or WD-40, but a little bit in there and free it up a little bit. And that's going to allow the cam system between the rudder cam, the plunger, the spring, the Delrin screw, all to work. The other one I've seen over the years is people will continue to tighten up that Delrin screw and it collapses the spring. You really need travel in that spring for it to move. So keep wanting it in there isn't really achieving a lot. I forget what year it was, maybe 10 years ago, we actually changed the spring in there. It was a stiffer spring. I think it came from Hobies Europe. But the old thing that sticks in my mind, it used to go, I think it was 1 3/4 inches. I think it was 1 3/4 inches, maybe 1 5/8, was a standing height for a spring. Don't quote me on that quite number. And a lot of people you could take and put it in a vise and you can stretch it back over. What I'm trying to get at is you need travel in that spring to make the system work. If you don't have it, then you'll end up with a lot of cases of the rudder cam staying down. Every time you pull the thing up, it won't flip up that way. So really pay attention to that. And also, if you don't turn your screw once in a while, it will seize up and then you have no adjustment. And it does control your rudder kick up. Another real little bit of a tip you can do too is, I wish I had a casting to show you. In the top of the rudder casting is a cam plate, and it goes through the casting. There's a bolt on the top of it, and you can move it forward and aft to make it lock. One of the things I see people do is they pull the rudder down, they lock the castings together, they loosen up, and they jam the cam plate as far forward in the cam as you can and lock it down. You got to be careful. By pushing that forward into the rudder cam, you can actually preload the rudder cam. It'll actually cause it to trip up a bit more. I always like it to where the front edge of that cam plate sits inside the rudder cam, and you can just barely move the upper rudder casting, and you can feel the cam plate inside the cam without preloading it. And number two is, if you look at the front edge of the cam plate, you can actually put a screwdriver in there and make sure that the front edge of the cam plate is in line with the rudder cam. You can actually get them off center a little bit, and you don't get that full bearing contact. I'll try to get some spare parts next time, and I'll show you those in one of the next interviews of what I'm kind of talking about. If you do look at the cam plate, it'll have a front edge on it, and you have the rudder cam that locks on. And as you tighten it, the cam plate can slide off center, and your cam isn't quite sitting 100%. So it's these little kind of 1% things that make a difference. Standing height of the spring itself, making sure it has some travel, and that cam plate sitting inside that rudder cam there. And if you do that, you'll never have a problem with the rudder cam, ever. And you can flick rudders up and down all day long. You can, going upwind from the trapeze, you can kick your tiller arm up and, lift your cam up while you're actually sailing and lock it back down. If it's maintained well and you got the correct spring tension, the correct travel, and everything's locking, it's a really, really good system, but they are a little bit high maintenance.
All right. All right, why don't we jump back to the PowerPoint here and talk a little more about the system here. All right, so some connectors here, and we just talked about the Hobie 20 tiller connector shown on the right in the video. The older style here is in the center and on the left. This was kind of a bolt together thing with a little spring on it. It generally worked okay, but sometimes those bolts, needed a little maintenance. You can see the one that picture on the far left, the little white plastic part has gotten a little bit distorted and probably time to be replaced, but it worked, but it wasn't, in my impression, just quite as clean of a connection as the Hobie 20 system. Any thoughts on that, Steve?
Oh, it's just evolution. You take an off the beach boat and, you got to the surf and you got tiller arms, you got to the crossbar, and you're just steering, you're having a great old day. And then, people, let's go racing, and they try to improve things a little bit and they change it, put some things. I'm not quite 100% sure, but I think Murray's actually came out with that, the Murray tiller connector kits. And all it was is just a bit more bushings and fillers so that you had a little bit more control. And then obviously the Hobie 20 came along, and, you go into some of the top end racing boats that stage tornadoes and things like that. And there's just no play at all. It's just a dialed in. And that's where they came out of the Murray tiller connectors. The Hobie 20 connectors. I think it's a 1954 part number now or something. And it just made no play whatsoever, and also an easy way of adjusting it. Before, on that photo onto the screen with the near the rear crossbar, originally they just had one adjuster, and it was only on one side. And then that would make it to where your tiller extension was not quite to center a little bit. Then later on, they added one to either side so you could keep your tiller extension and the yoke in the middle of the thing. And then obviously they changed and went into the Miracle style tillers. And now they're threaded on one side, and I think it's one turn is 1 millimeter. So you can actually adjust it while you're out there sailing. All of a sudden you can measure on the beach, and you get out there and you pull things on, either the toe end or the dolphin striker is not right. You get a bit of helm that you don't want. you can actually just tweak it a little bit and kind of dial in your boat, your helm, to suit that particular boat, that particularly in world championships, because you got a very small amount of time. And sometimes you get out there and you need to do a bit of a fine tuning on the water. You just spin it one turn or not. So it's just an evolvement from off the beach cat to trying to make the 16, a racing boat as such. And like a lot of things, that rear boat you saw has a traveler track on the crossbar, the same as they had it on the front crossbar. Well, people started, going smaller profile blocks and going from 4-to-1 to 5-to-1 to 6-to-1, and everything's going low profile. You carry more mass rate, more loading. So it's just like anything. This boat, it's a boat that was built in 68, 69, and here it is. We're just here working on a Hobie World Championship now, and it's still there, and it's probably still one of the best one design classes. And things have changed. It's improved, and they're not expensive changes. They just kept up with times. I mean, it's good to see. Looking at these old photos, I have some flashbacks of tracks pulling off the back, or the stainless steel jig tracks ripping off the front, and just a lot of fun that way. But it's really good that the Hobie 16 has really stood the test of time. And I tell you what, that Florida Worlds, that was a lot of fun. People who did make the time and effort, it just really brought back home how cool that boat is and how much fun you can have with something that's just an off the beach, no center boards, just sheet on, max out, let her rip. That's all. Good boat.
All right. Before we go in, a couple of questions come in. A couple of people asked the same question about lubrication. Is there a particular product recommended for lubricating the cam system in the lower casting?
Everyone uses their flavor of sprays. Some people use a silicone spray. Some use like inox, WD-40s, etc. The biggest saying is anything is better than none. I mean, if you have nothing at all, go get some dishwashing liquid and pour down it. It's soap. You're looking for some lubrication to free up the plunger. The plunger is the one that really cups the most of it, because you've got an alloy casting, and it's kind of bored through, and you've got a plunger, and with sand, it scores up. And as it scores up, it causes a lot of friction. So you're trying to reduce that friction in there. I've seen a lot of people just take and spray a half a can of lubricant in there, and then they wonder why the rudders never stay down. So there's, excess is not the best. So a little bit does all you need. But the biggest thing I do before anything else is, if you have nothing at all, put some water in there. Off the back of the boat, and the beach, or the lake, whatever, get some lubricant, and then try to free up that plunger. The plunger is the number one thing, and then the spring to make it work together. That's the whole thing. So you just want the parts to move. It's moving parts, they've got to move. There is no flavor of the day. I mean, if you don't have anything, you got Armor All for your car, put some Armor All in there. It's just personal preference. There's not one thing that's better than the other. Some silicone sprays are very tacky, like WD-40 and inox, and they tend to attract sand, and that just makes it like a machining compound. So you have a lubricant, and you have sand, like sandpaper, and all it does is wear things out. So a water-based silicone product like Armor or something, or a dishwashing liquid. I used to make my own lubricants. We had a bit of Teflon material in it, and a little bit of silicone and water, and a little bit of dishwashing liquid, and it was a great lubricant. It cleaned as it went, and it stopped that abrasion in there. So anything is better than nothing. You just got to make moving parts move. That's the ticket. They got to move.
All right, good advice. Oh, this one's out of place. Let's skip that. All right, so moving more into the systems here, and quick shot about tillers. So on the right in this picture is the sort of was commonly called the hot stick. And this was the only one I could find. Actually, it was a really, really old one that's in poor condition and had some fiberglass on it. But these have gone out of production and aren't made anymore. They were really popular in the 80s. There is still a carbon, a telescoping tiller that Hobie manufactures and sells. It's a carbon fiber tiller called the Wildcat tiller. I didn't have an example of that to show. Maybe Steve, you can comment on that. The next one over is the standard white fiberglass tiller that comes with the boat. And then the last one on the left there is a straight black carbon fiber tiller. So at least we still see some hot sticks around, but they're becoming pretty rare. Seeing less and less of those. What I'm seeing more of is the carbon fiber tillers and the straight white tillers being used. What's your experience with that, Steve?
I've used them all and I've broken them all. So that's just a tiller. You know, the old days, they started off with the, you know, you had some alloy tillers in the early days, and they did lightweight tubing. The nice thing about anything lightweight, it's easy to flip around the back of the main sheet, get on the upper sack, jump out on the wire, and away you go. Different styles require different tillers. There's a lot of guys who like to sail with longer tillers, kind of up in the air or over the shoulders. There's others who like to hold it in the hands, and that was the beauty of the Ariba stick or the hot stick. The downside of that is because generally you will always lock it off in one spot. After constantly locking it in the same spot year after year after year, it would over rotate. So you'd have to cut some off in the air. The downside of a hot stick or the Ariba stick, that one, is also the weight of the thing. So you had to balance out your style of steering the boat, whatever craft you're on, whether you hold it in your base of your hand versus flipping the tiller around, how fast you could do it. So that's one thing. The alloy tillers were okay, but the early alloys, they weren't very forgiving. As soon as you bent them, they would break. I know in Australia, there was a tiller produced by Ronstadt for many years. It was a different extrusion. It had ribs in there, and it was very, very forgiving. I think Mick Butler used to swear by those things. And you could bend them in half almost, and they would just really, a very nice tiller. A lot of guys back then would put a cork fitting on the end of the tiller, and they could flip it behind the boat, and it would kind of sit on the water a little bit, and you could pick it up and grab it to make your tack back and forth. And obviously you've got the original tillers that we have now that come with the Hobies. The only thing we do for Worlds is in the last couple of years is we made them a little bit longer because you had some people, 6'5" or whatever, with the original Hobie 16 white tiller, they couldn't reach the tiller. So Worlds we take and do it this way. So they're all serve their purpose between lightweight, adjustability, and styles. And everyone makes them, but I think we've all gone through the hot stick stage of our life because it was there. Obviously, you know, when the Wildcat came out, you had a very lightweight carbon fiber adjustable tiller. They're still my favorite. They're pretty robust. I remember probably in 97s to 2000, everyone's going crazy with carbon Kevlar tillers. I think I had them as standard equipment on Hobie 16 Worlds in the year 2000 in Noumea. Probably one of my second worst decisions in my life as far as OEM equipment. People were breaking those left, right, and center. Beautiful tiller if you knew how to handle them. And these guys still swear by them and still love them. But forgiving, no. Matter of fact, guys used to run a bit of shock cord or a bit of, say 3 or 4 millimeter pre-stretched line all the way through it. So if it did break, it would kind of hold itself together and you could get around the cans to make it back to the beach for your new tiller. But it's just like anything else. We've all evolved. I think a lot of guys have gone back to a single piece, one-piece one, whether it be alloy, like a Ronstadt style, or a fixed length carbon tiller. Now, I think that's still the flavor subject to the kind of boat that you're sailing on now. I mean, obviously, things are a little bit different with, say, a Hobie 16 than you do something with a spinnaker-based boat where you're, doing a lot of high wind, high speed, downwind sailing. A light tiller is very nice to be able to hang on to, and less very, very forgiving as far as getting around the boat that way. So it's personal preference. Again, I wouldn't, as a new sailor, getting a boat and buying a $1,000 to $3,000 boat, go spend $300 or $400 on a carbon tiller. It's all going to end up in tears in about a month's time when it breaks on you. So horses for courses.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. The carbon is nice, but it's definitely fragile, and but they're all breakable. All right. All right, let's see. We talked about the system a bit in the video, so let's just skip this, move on. All right. So again, some parts of the system here, and this one on the left, the difference between the one on the right is the difference between the adjustable and non-adjustable, and you kind of like sometimes see that, and it's not always clear to particularly some newer people with older boats what that means. So this boat on the right, you can see the bolt right on the top there, and the boat on the left doesn't have that. So it just adds that adjustability to change the rake a little bit easier compared to the originals. And do you recall, Steve, what years those were for those non-adjustable ones? I mean, that was early years, right?
Yeah, I don't know when they ended. Back then, though, those were the days where they were factory supplied rudders. The aftermarket blades hadn't come on there. But as soon as the aftermarket blades came on, there wasn't an easy way of changing the rudder rake. And the only way to do it was to fill the holes with resins, epoxies, or dowel, or whatever it is, and reposition your blade and re-drill it. And you would just sit there and turn the top of the rudder blade into spaghetti. I forget what year it was, probably in the 80s, they came up with these cam locks, so to speak. So you drill this, probably a 1-inch hole in your rudder, and you'd epoxy glue in this, I think they were alloy back then, module, and it had a star on there, and you could actually, the hole was drilled off center. So you could pull the fitting out, turn it around, and you could actually play with the rudder rake without having to drill a million holes in your rudder. And that was pretty popular for a long time. I mean, that's all I used to do. And then after that, there was on the system where you see the cam plate with the bolt in the top, there was a screw at the bottom that could adjust the rake fore and aft. And then obviously the cam plate, which I talked about earlier, making sure the cam plate's right. The downside of the rudder rake adjusting screw, if your holes in your rudder were not set up right, you end up having to put a lot of, to move the rudder back to increase the weather helm, you would take this hex screw in the bottom of your casting and start wadding it out, and that would push the rudder in the aft position. The downside is you had a 2-piece rudder with a polyester joining compound on the inside, and you kept punching holes into the front of the rudder blade. And the same thing happened with the EPO. EPO was very, very thin in that section. And a lot of EPO rudders were destroyed by people they wouldn't have the holes in the right position, and then have to rake the thing out. And that's why the EPO 2s, we came up with a set of holes to where we actually removed the grub screw from the lower casting and threw it away. It doesn't even become standard anymore. And it had sufficient helm that people wouldn't start playing around with rudder rake. And I don't think today too many people do re-drill EPO 2s and 3s, especially 3s not. It has helm without question. Is it heavy? Perhaps a little bit, but it's a bolt-on kind of go. But that's the two systems there. One was a lower casting, so you could actually adjust it. And if you had to adjust the lower casting, it meant technically the holes in the blade, whether in the center of the blade or the upper part of the rudder casting, weren't quite in that right position, but it did give you that flexibility for the various third-party blades. Third-party blades had a lot of different profiles, a lot of different shapes, and they all sailed differently, and they all, also mass rake was changing back then, from the old 5-to-1 systems to now the new profile. So as you load the rudder blades back up, you're actually taking and you don't need to take and pull those blades back anymore. There already is that sufficient weather helm versus lee helm on here. I mean, if you read the old performance racing books, that they had many years ago about, what kind of angles and stuff, that's all kind of gone and eliminated. And all really the cam plate does now is you can adjust a little bit in there, but the cam plate really is to adjust the wear that's between the bolt holes, the upper and lower rudder casting, and the rudder cam itself. That's its main real function, so to speak. You can back it off and it can let the blade creep back a bit. I don't know too many people who want more helm in an EPO 3 on a Hobie 16 the way it's rigged today. If anything, you might want to creep it forward a little bit, but most of the guys these days are sailing upwind on one rudder, and it's a fairly balanced blade, so it looks good.
Yeah, I would echo that. Years ago, we all used to re-drill, and now, as far as I know, no one seems to re-drill. So Everyone's happy with that. So question that came in here on the EPO3, the little black, neoprene rubber pad that impacts between, as a buffer between the blade and the casting. Can you comment on the purpose of that?
Yeah, you still have two different variations of lower rudder castings between the USA rudder and the European rudder system. And all we're trying to do is build in a bit of buffer, because you still have a very sharp, you got a rounded edge on the EPO. EPO3 was a lot flatter, so it would fit the castings a bit better. But the idea behind it is, flicking your rudders up and down year after year after year. If you put that little bit of neoprene in there, it's just like a fuse. It's a bit of a buffer, and it takes up that gap. And that's what it's for, is that it's glued in, and it's just so that as you're jamming those rudders down, and you're getting, 2 or 3 years out of it, is you're just protecting the leading edge of the rudder blade. EPO3s will pretty much take it as opposed to other ones, but what we found is it's just a variation between the two styles of rudder castings, of how it sits inside the foam pad, as we call it. It contours to whatever rudder casting you have, either European and or HCC, Hobie USA style. That's what it's for.
All right. Well, perfect segue to our next slide here. This is a European Hobie 16, and there's not many differences, but there are a few, and this is one of them. And Steve can comment in a second. I mean, this is a work in progress to standardize the production, but this, you can notice here where the little arrow is, one of the main differences in this European system is, rather than the upper casting having a right and left, the tiller arm has a little bend in it, where on the US boats and the Australian boats, the tiller arm is straight, and there's a distinct right and left upper casting to have a little bit of a bend to create that angle, that Ackerman angle that the rudder system needs. Any comments on this, Steve?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. So a lot of this is just evolution. Some is manufacturing. So obviously in the early days, we would have the bent arms, and one of the old things back then is to try to, you're changing the angle of attack between the different sides of the hull, because the boat is spinning at different speeds. That's what we're talking about. And I remember in the early days, like guys like Bob Curry and some of especially the Hobie Florida guys that were sailing Hobie 14s, would really try to increase that radius between the two boats. And eventually the class had to come out and have a fixed length for the tiller crossbar to try to contain that. From a manufacturing point of view, is you had a case where you had a bending jig, and you'd have to bend the extrusion. Typically you would have raw extrusion, you'd bend it, you send out to the anodizers. And an easy way of doing it and achieving really the same thing is cast the upper castings like ex-USA with those angles in, and then just have a straight tube. There's no manufacturing, there's no label. It's a tubing that's been anodized. You run it through a drop saw, you chuck in a few rivets and end caps, and you're done. So from a manufacturer cost point of view, it's easier to go with the curved castings and straight arms, because it's really, really simple. It still achieves the same thing. And the European is, it's very similar. They've just gone with the opposite. They've gone straight castings, and they've still gone with the labor intense side of bending that. Obviously they can't tweak them anymore because of the fixed length of the crossbar. The class rules changed many, many, many moons ago. But that's one of the things that we're looking at now is which system we're going to end up with on a global basis. Some will be, I don't know. I don't have the verdict is still out, and I'm kind of horse trading back and forth with Europe right now over what we're going to do. But that's really the real difference between the two. The other one too is I saw somewhere about the different bolt holes. The holes in the European casting positioning is different than the USA. So you can't have these templates. And even with a template that you can print off, in the manufacturing process, you'll get a little bit of creep when they're drilling these things in there. So it's not exact boat for boat for boat, casting, casting, casting. Sometimes they'll be out a little bit, and you'll take and put a jig on it. So templates are only as good as the castings you're applying them to. If you take a USA template, try to apply it into European castings, the holes are in a different location. They're not even, it's not even close. So you got to keep that in mind. It's just trial and error. There's some good measurements you can do, measuring so many inches down from the head, straight edge down the front, what percentage you want to be inside, 1.5 inches, 1.5 inches, whatever it is. If you took off the standard EPO3 measurements now, and you're dealing with USA or Australian built boats, it works. It's in the ballpark. Just borrow someone's rudder, lay it on top, draw a few holes, and drill it, and away you go. But that's really the main differences between the two. The other thing that changes on the European boats is that they take their hinge yoke. The fitting on the American's boat is a 3205, and it through bolts through the tiller crossbar. There are some spacers inside. It's a 1/4 inch bolt by, I think, 1.25 inches with a nylock nut. The Europeans have the fitting actually on the tiller, and that makes it a bit tricky when the Europeans try to come to running in worlds with kind of HCC style of boats. But other than that, we're still all using the Hobie Miracle style tiller end caps, the adjustability on one side. But other than those two systems, there's very, very little. They're really achieving the same thing. There's not one that I would say has any advantage over the other, because you're going from straight arm to curve arms and bent tubes to straight tubes. It's exactly the same. It's a Hobie 16. Get a good start, go the right way upwind, and you're home and hosed.
Yeah, and I've sailed both of them in recent years, and they both sailed very well. I don't notice any differences. So, all right, so a couple more here. We're almost getting to the end here. So I put some things in on gudgeons, and this kind of goes back to some of the older boats here. This is the older 2-part gudgeon, and this picture on the right I actually found today, and it was a very nice example of what the problem was with this really old gudgeon. So I mean, this was probably 30 plus years old, and eventually the metal gave up and it broke. And more commonly, the top one would break. All right, let's see what the next one is here. All right, and this is kind of what would happen. There would be some damage. So this was an old Hobie 14, and you can see the lip. I mean, Steve, you can talk about this. This was kind of common. The lip would get kind of damaged at the back end here when the pin let loose, and people would notch it out with a hacksaw rather than fix it. And the other thing that would happen is on this one on the left, is the screws would break, and you would end up having trouble with the screws and repairing the screws inside the back of the boat. So maybe Steve, can you just comment on the structure in the back of the boat and how this all is put together?
You've given me ulcers here. Look at the back of these boats. So you got a couple things going on. I mean, there's even older ones in this. So the photo of the one on the right, it shows a lower gudgeon casting, and it has a loop. And even prior to that, they had one, and the middle was even thinner. But back then you had nylon or plastic rudder pins. And the idea behind it, just talked about earlier, again, putting a plastic blade on a boat. You got to have a fuse somewhere in the system. So the nylon rudder pins would just break before the back of the boat did. If you go back one slide that you had. So you had, people started racing. There you go. So people started racing, and you had a lot of rudder slop. And then they did, and that one photograph that you've got of the Brook on the right-hand side, we sleeved it. And the idea is that you went to alloy rudder pins, and then later in life, we went to stainless steel rudder pins. So by sleeving it, you reduced so much slop. And all that slop did was cause a heck of a lot of cavitation, because the blutter blade is doing this upwind, downwind, and it's just like you're fighting weather helm, lee helm the whole time. So they sleeved it, and that was a good idea. They then obviously had the star washers that you see here, which are the old school lock washers. And then that photograph to the left-hand side showed the version after it, where you had two pieces of metal with a seam together. And again, that was the idea, is it reduced some of the play. All those breaks were generally as a result of the welding process more than anything else. It's just they were being kind of overheated as they put the things together, and that's kind of why they broke. Yeah, it just evolved. Go back to the next slide again. Okay, so the one on the right, you can see the very old one at the bottom with no sleeve at all, and then you'll see the one that was probably designed in the late 80s, early 90s, which wasn't a bad one. The nice thing about that one is you could actually take a center punch and put 4 little center punch dots in there, and actually even tighten up even more. So that was the whole thing. But why the upper part of the boat used to break is one is probably how they were put together back then. So you had the two halves of the boat, upper hull and lower hull, and they had a little bit of glass and some joining compound, and you clamp it together. It wasn't a strong area at all, which has changed, many, many years ago. But what we've done is just kept improving the gudgeons. And when the gudgeon's in place and doesn't move and you don't have a lot of play, then the rudder pin can't go side to side. And as the rudder pin went side to side, is you get elongation in the upper part of the deck. And then obviously you get cracking, and then people used to notch them out. But that's all been eliminated completely with the new systems of how they're put together. The boats are actually glassed together back there. We do a lot of things that are slightly different. It makes them a little bit stronger. It also makes it a bit there. For viewers who don't know what's behind here, I get questions all the time. So you have a plywood backing plate that's in there, and so you have the mold itself, and you've got the gel coat spread in. You have the laminate in there, and then you have a piece of plywood that was an exterior ply. I think they're 1/4 inch or 6 mil back then, and then you have an alloy plate that was glued inside, and then some fabric over it. And these are all drilled and tap fittings, and they're 1/4-20s. One of the nice things about it, if you broke one, you had to drill it out, and drilling out stainless is not the easiest thing you could do it. But the nice thing is you could run a tap through it, and you'd go 5/16. So originally, I think they were 3/16, and then you go 1/4 inch, and then you go 5/16. And then after that, you have to put an inspection port in and screw bolt it. Obviously, this change is some of the materials. The stainless has gotten better. We've got nylock nuts now that have a little insert so they don't back out. We've also, there you go, there's the nylock nut. And then we've gone with a full piece gudgeon. This came out of the Europe boats. And then 20 years ago, you had the USA tool up for them. The main differences between the two castings, one is really more imperial base, the other one is metric base. And they have a set of bushings which are replaceable. Just so people know, for Worlds, we actually line bore and drill for Worlds boats, and we add 2 extra bushings in a Worlds boat, so that eliminates the play. Because at the end of the day, a Worlds boat is really like a solid year of sailing. It's, if you had a good year of recreational sailing, you're out there 52 times. And you look at a Worlds that we're on the water for a month. So we actually take and line bore, and then we put a couple of extra bushings, and there is virtually 0 play in a Worlds boat from day one. And the other thing, a trick is sometimes you can use a USA casting, and then sometimes a European rudder pin and metric, and it's probably the best fit. My choice is, because they're dealing with the different systems, metric and imperial, is you can really, without having a lot of trouble of just swapping the things around as the boat gets older with age, drop in a metric pin, and everything, it just goes away. And the goal is to try to do it. Again, what you're looking at the back of the boat, you have a lot more area, and by having more screws in there, you really are attaching the gudgeon. The problem you have in the old boats, especially on the upper rudder casting or the gudgeon, is you only have 2 fastening points, and they're originally 3/16 in the 1/4 inch. And with the rudder, it takes a lot of abuse. A lot of the damage is kind of sometimes in the shore break. As you come in, you're sideways to the boat, a wave hits it, and you've got something that's 2 foot long, and you're giving a big yank, and those 2 boats can move a little bit. So by having that in there, it stops that whole casting from moving, which makes it different. The Australian boats and the Worlds boats have a different upper screw in there. So in the Australia, with the pretty much the stronger sea breezes they face, the standard 1/4-20 roundhead machine screws, for some reason, kept breaking. And what we did is, on the uppers of all the Worlds boats for the last probably 5 years, is when we built it, we drilled it out to 1/4-20. And we have to grind the head of this down so it actually fits in there. But we've had 0 failures for all the Worlds, as long as I can remember, by going with a larger bolt in there. So it's something different. It could be the fact that in Europe doesn't seem to have the problem as much as, say, the South Pacific does with the stronger winds. Europe, I think, generally, don't hang me for this, sails in lighter conditions. They do have some wind, but more lakes, things this way. They also use a very fine metric there, so it may not have that tendency to loosen up as much. But I know once we went to the Nylox, it made a big difference. But by going with a lot more fastenings, more of a bearing surface for the casting to anchor on, so it can't twist and move, and the fact that we're glassing the upper deck and the hull together now, it's physically glass filleted together instead of just being a bog or a joining compound. In the early days, it was just polyester resin and Cabosil. And then now we've gone, then you had the Probond super lights, and the Probond materials were more of a joining compound. Here we use a vinyl ester joining compound, but it has a fillet of fiberglass. We put that inside and clamp it. So it's now physically glassed together. We've also made the hole a little bit bigger, so if there is any movement into the castings, especially in older boats, it doesn't break out, and we very rarely have any breaking. You will get some crazing or small gel coat cracks in the top if your boat gets loose, or if you get some worn out rudder castings to rudder pin things. But just to tell you what, the boat is so bulletproof now, the spare part sales is almost none on a Hobie 16, and it used to be the livelihood of a Hobie dealer. You sold a Hobie 16, and every Sunday or Saturday you'd see them in the store buying bits and pieces. Those days are gone. So over years, from off the beach to now, probably one of the strongest One Design sailing non-daggerboard boats out there, One Design. It's done very well, and we made a lot of improvements over the years. And there's still a few things I know I've got up my sleeve I'm going to play around with. We're working on the next few boats kind of in first part of September. And but yeah, all these are improvements to make it where you have a great day on the water, maintenance free, and the guys that are racing really just worry about their tactics and their starts and getting around the racetrack, and definitely a lot more time at the bar after racing rather than fixing boats. And I know as a Hobie sailor, that's the most important part of all of the production decisions we make is more quality bar time.
That's good. Yeah, it's definitely no fun when, I'm just skipping ahead a little bit. It's definitely no fun when you, whether you're racing or you're just out for the day of fun, when your boat is broken and you have to deal with that. So
the USA bushings.
All right, so just at the end here, I put some stuff in about bushing, tensioning, weather helm, and we have a question here on tow in and tow out. So it might be good to wrap up with that. So these are some items available from your dealer: the bushings that are replaceable in the gudgeon, and these little plastic shims that's a little hard to see in the picture, but that can be fitted into your rudder blade in between the blade and the casting to stiffen things up. And like I said in my video, there is to keep everything from being all wiggly. You want everything nice and snug. So,
the bushings are good. You really need those. They're kind of a bit of a pain to put in, but once you learn how to do them, it makes a huge difference, especially into the holes where the bolts go through. Another little trick is what we do sometimes in World's boats is at the very bottom of the casting, we'll drill 2 small holes, and we actually put a cable tie in there. And all it does is it really firms up that gap between the rudder castings, which there's a bit of variation in where the rudder blade goes inside. The photo of the black plastic inserts, they're an okay insert. They're better than nothing. My preference is the European bushings. They are a better fit, especially if you use a metric rudder pin. The alloy pins seem to be slightly different in diameter than the stainless pins. And a lot of times in Worlds, we'll use the alloy pin from Europe and European bushings, and they don't move. All your Hobie dealers have access to those European bushings. They're a little bit longer, and you can just glue them in. But anything is better than nothing, without question. You mean comment at all on tow in, tow out?
Yeah, we had a question on that about tow in and tow out for the Hobie 16.
There's some basic rules of thumb. Generally, you want to hake and have rudder tow in a little bit. It can vary, depends on your sailing style. If you're an upwind sailor all the time with one person, Got it sailing one blade, it's not that crucial, but the general rule of thumb is going to be probably that 3 to 6 millimeters of toe in. The one thing I like about the new style tiller connectors is sometimes you'll get a bit of variation in the boat between, say, the dolphin striker tension or the jib halyard tension, and you'll get out there and it may not feel like you want. On the water, you can just wind that adjuster in and out, and you can actually change a little bit of that helm there. But from someone trying to take and set their boats up, if you used 5 millimeter, just throw a number out there, you're in the ballpark. And some people do 3, some people use 6. I don't use 6 myself. I'm kind of that 3 to 4 range. But if anywhere, it's like the EPO. It's a very forgiving, very full rudder. If you use 4 to 5 millimeters toe in, fantastic. It'll get you in the ballpark. But I like to be able to adjust my rudder on the water a little bit and just wind it in and out, because sometimes you'll measure it, you get out there and go, oh, it doesn't feel right. You can change it on the water real quickly just by a turn. I think it's one full turn, and I think it's either 0.5 millimeter or 1 millimeter. It's been a few years I've been on a boat, but that'll get you in the ballpark. But the biggest thing of all these things, it's all reliant on those castings being together. I've seen people adjust them on the beach, but then their upper and lower bolts are loose as a goose, and the rudder blade is doing this. So there's no point. So you really want to get it to where, especially worlds, I mean, you're doing up and down all day, is tension that up, get all the play out of that you can with your bolts, then measure the rudder toe in. Too many people will take and do their toe in, but the rudder blades can do this in the casting. So it just doesn't work that way. It's a combination of tillers, no movement between the tiller crossbar and the tiller arms, the upper and lower bolt holes done up tight to where it's a nice snug fitting up and down, then set your toe in, knowing the fact if you get out there, if it just feels wrong, just adjust it until it feels good. If it feels good, it doesn't matter what it is. As long as you're going fast, that's all that matters.
All right, good. That's great advice. All right. Well, we went a little over the hour here. It's probably time to wrap up there, but really good stuff.
And I'm almost out of iced tea too.
All right. If anybody has any questions, we don't have any open questions, but like I said, this has been recorded and will be published on YouTube on the Hobie Class channel for other folks to see if they weren't able to join us today live. So anyway, thanks so much for Steve. It was a really informative. I learned some new things. I'm sure we all did to hear about the history and the manufacturing. So and we're hoping to have Steve back for a future episode to talk more about just general manufacturing at the Hobie factory. So I think Steve will have some interesting stuff to share with us there. So.
And some stuff not to share.
Sure.
Thanks, Rich, for having me on. It's great here. I'll try to bring a few parts so people can understand about that cam plate, what I'm talking about. It's probably not as clear, but the biggest thing is the questions are what really is crucial in this style of format in these webinars. That this is the opportunity to say, hey, what's your take on this? Here's the problem I'm not sailing good. Here's my rudder problems. We can solve it. And then we can open this up to whatever it is. And in my kind of 40 plus years with Hobie, just like you, we've heard all the questions and we know the kind of the shortcuts, and more importantly, what to do to get you in the ballpark. You know, it's sometimes, oh, I'm in the 3rd hole, I'm in the 4th hole. Great, but how long is your side stay? So there's some little things here that we can do, and I really appreciate some of those questions on here. And thanks for the invite. It's been my pleasure. I always love to talk about sailing, in particular Hobie 16 sailing.
All right, good stuff. All right, well, let's wrap up now, and we'll hope you guys can join us again for the next episode.